Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today we're diving into one of the most famous stories in history, the Titanic. From its grand design and luxury to the tragic night it sank, we'll uncover the full story together. So grab a seat, and let's begin this journey through time. In 1912, the Titanic was called the unsinkable ship. It was the largest and most luxurious ocean liner ever built, a floating palace carrying dreams across the Atlantic. But just days into its first voyage, tragedy struck, taking more than 1,500 lives. This is not just a story of disaster. It is a story of human courage, mistakes, hope, and loss. Join us as we explore the full story of the Titanic, from its grand beginning to its unforgettable end. The story of the Titanic did not begin on the ocean. It began in the muddy, noisy, and colossal shipyards of Belfast, Ireland. This place was known as Harland and Wolff, and it was here that men built floating cities. For 3 years, the two biggest ships the world had ever imagined, the Olympic and the Titanic, grew side by side like twin mountains of steel. The Titanic was not just big, she was a miracle of scale. When she stood on the dry dock, she was so tall that the people on the ground below looked like tiny dolls. Her hull was longer than 4 city blocks and heavier than all the stone in a great castle. To hold her together, 3 million rivets, little metal nails that held the steel plates, were hammered in by thousands of strong, sweaty men. The sheer noise of her building was a thunder that never stopped. The man in charge of her design was Thomas Andrews. He was not a flashy man. He was quiet, serious, and utterly brilliant. He knew every single piece of her, from the giant anchors that weighed as much as a small house to the delicate wallpaper in the first-class cabins. Andrews was her father, her architect, and her fiercest defender. He had given her a special secret: 16 huge, strong compartments that were watertight. If the sea broke into 1, 2, or even 4 of these compartments, the ship would simply shrug it off. She was designed, engineered, and whispered to be practically unsinkable. The very name, Titanic, came from the Titans, the giants of Greek mythology. She was meant to be a giant in a new, modern age. She was a statement of pride, a challenge to the wild, dark Atlantic Ocean. We are humanity, and we have conquered you. When the Titanic was finally finished, she was not a ship, but a palace that could move. The builders had poured every ounce of luxury and wealth they could imagine into her core. First class was a golden dream. The grand staircase was the beating heart of the ship, a towering spectacle of polished oak, wrought iron, and glass that seemed to float from the top deck down 7 levels. Sunlight poured in through a massive dome. The dining room was like a king's hall, longer than any room on land, with crystal glasses and silver plates. They had a swimming pool filled with warm, salted water, a true miracle at sea. They had a Turkish bath to sweat out their worries and a squash court to play games. The passengers here were the true titans of industry and money. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, the wealthiest man on board, and his young, pregnant wife Madeline. Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining magnate who carried more money than most people saw in a lifetime. And the loud, kind-hearted Margaret Molly Brown, it was said, was as tough as any diamond. Second class was still better than first class on most other ships. It was elegant and proper, filled with teachers, merchants, and writers. Third class, or steerage, was tucked deep in the belly of the ship. But even here, the conditions were better than most immigrants had ever seen. These passengers were mostly families from Ireland, Scandinavia, and Europe, carrying their dreams in worn suitcases, hoping for a new, better life in America. They were the hopeful heart of the ship. On April 10th, 1912, the Titanic sailed from Southampton, England. As she pulled away from the dock, a strange thing happened. The sheer volume of water she pushed aside caused the smaller liner, the New York, to break her moorings and swing directly toward the Titanic. Only a swift reaction from the captain and crew prevented a massive collision right there in the harbor. It was a terrifying, heart-stopping near miss, a tiny dark whisper of what was to come. The 4 days the Titanic spent sailing the Atlantic were days of pure sunlight and calm. The ocean was like glass, the sky was wide and blue, and the ship moved with a gentle, confident purr. In first class, life was a continuous, sparkling party. Ladies wore dresses that weighed a ton and glittered like the stars. Men smoked cigars and talked of money and power in the smoking rooms. Colonel Astor, handsome and reserved, walked the decks with his young wife, Madeline. Molly Brown, full of energy and laughter, was impossible to miss. They were all sure of their safety. How could they not be? They were on the greatest, strongest ship ever built, commanded by the esteemed Captain Edward John Smith, a respected sea captain who had already decided this would be his last voyage before retirement. Meanwhile, below decks, the atmosphere was different, but just as joyful. In third class, families gathered for huge communal meals. Young men and women, immigrants heading to cities like New York, Chicago, and Winnipeg, danced to the wild music of fiddles and pipes in the common rooms. They were leaving behind hunger and sadness, and they believed this great ship was carrying them straight into the arms of good fortune. But out beyond the luxurious railings, the real world was signaling danger. The winter of 1912 had been strangely warm, causing a huge number of icebergs to break off the glaciers of Greenland and drift south, directly into the Titanic's path. Throughout Sunday, April 14th, the ship's wireless room received 6 different warnings from other vessels about fields of dangerous ice. A ship called the Caronia warned of bergs and pack ice. The German ship America warned of 2 large icebergs. The Mesaba reported much heavy pack ice and a great number of large icebergs. Yet, not all of these messages were treated with the urgency they deserved. The wireless operators, employees of the Marconi Company, and not the White Star Line, were bogged down transmitting thousands of personal messages from the wealthy passengers. One of the last warnings came at 9:40 p.m. from a ship called the Californian. They were so surrounded by ice that they had stopped for the night. The Californian's operator desperately tried to send a message to the Titanic, but the sound of the Titanic's powerful radio signal overwhelmed his receiver. The Titanic's operator, Jack Phillips, was furious at the interruption to his work. He snapped back, "Shut up, shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race." With the last, most urgent warning dismissed, the Titanic continued to race through the smooth, dark water at almost her top speed, 22.5 knots. The captains of the era believed that lookouts would spot any hazard in time. Tonight, however, the conditions were perfect for disaster. A dead calm, sea meant no waves breaking at the iceberg's base to give it away, and a moonless, star-bright sky made the black ice virtually invisible until the last second. At 11:40 p.m., the moment of truth arrived. In the crow's nest, high above the deck, lookout Frederick Fleet was peering into the deep black. The air was bitterly cold, so cold it burned his throat. The water was perfectly calm, a massive mirror reflecting the stars. Then he saw it. It wasn't a shadow. It was the absence of stars. A darker dark in the blackness. A colossal, ghostly shape of ice, rising out of the sea directly in their path. Fleet grabbed the bell rope and rang the alarm 3 times, the signal for danger dead ahead. Then he phoned the bridge. "Iceberg. Right ahead," he yelled, the 2 most terrifying words in maritime history. The officer on the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch, reacted instantly. He shouted 3 quick orders. Hard A starboard. Turn the wheel fully left, stop the engines, and then full astern, full reverse. The massive ship began to turn, agonizingly slowly. For 37 long seconds, she struggled against her own momentum. She missed hitting the iceberg head-on, a blow she might have survived. Instead, the sharp, submerged shelf of the ice scraped along the ship's side below the waterline. It was not a loud, crashing impact, but a shudder, a deep grinding sound that only the crew and a few passengers felt. To some, it felt like running over 1,000 marbles. Captain Smith rushed to the bridge. The engineers went below to assess the damage. What they found was horrifying. The long, grazing blow had not left a single, neat gash, but 6 tiny, hairline cuts in the plates below the waterline, running through the first 5 of the ship's watertight compartments. Water was pouring into the forward boiler rooms, the mail room, where postal clerks fought to save 10 tons of mail, and the cargo holds. Thomas Andrews, the man who knew the ship best, was called to the bridge. He listened carefully to the reports, pulled out his blueprints, and, with a sinking heart, did the simple mathematics. The Titanic could float with 4 compartments flooded. With 5 compartments open to the sea, she was doomed. The water would fill the first 5 sections, pull the bow down, and then pour over the tops of the watertight bulkheads, spilling into the 6th, then the 7th, and so on. He looked at Captain Smith, his face ashen. "I have no doubt, Captain," Andrews said gently. "She is mortally wounded. She can only stay afloat for an hour, perhaps 2 at the most." The truth was delivered in a whisper, but it sounded like a thunderclap. The unsinkable ship was going to sink. At 12:05 a.m., Captain Smith gave the desperate order to call for help over the wireless. The signal sent was the new distress call, CQD. Later, they switched to the brand new, rarely used signal, SOS. The nearest ship, the Carpathia, was 58 miles away and speeding to the rescue, but she would take nearly 4 hours to arrive. It was already too late. The orders to uncover the lifeboats were given, but there was a tragic, crippling flaw. The Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for 1,178 people. With 2,224 people on board, more than half were doomed before the first boat was even lowered. This was due to outdated laws that didn't account for the size of modern ships. The evacuation began with the famous rule: women and children first. This order resulted in a heartbreaking, beautiful, and sometimes chaotic scene. The heroic designer, Thomas Andrews, walked the decks, no longer as a passenger, but as a shepherd. He urged fearful passengers to put on their life belts and go to the boats. He spoke gently to those frozen by fear, his calm manner convincing many to leave. He gave away his own life belt. His final moments were spent alone in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting, having done everything humanly possible for his creation and the souls within it. The dignified gentleman, Benjamin Guggenheim, realizing the end was near, went back to his cabin, changed out of his casual wear, and put on his finest evening clothes. He was heard to say, "We've dressed up in our best, and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." The faithful couple, Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly owners of Macy's department store, were offered a spot on a lifeboat. Ida, a woman of deep devotion, refused to leave her husband, saying, "We have been living together for many years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on deck, waiting for the end. The unsinkable spirit, Molly Brown, was forced in a lifeboat 6. She immediately began trying to organize the fearful crew, demanding their return to the debris field to pull survivors from the water. Though met with resistance, her strength became a legend. The lowering of the boats was a disaster of inexperience. The crew was untrained, and many lifeboats were lowered into the water half empty, a devastating loss of precious space. The first boat left with only 28 people, even though it could hold 65. The officers feared the davits, the cranes that lowered the boats, would break, or that the rush of people would swamp the boats. As the time passed, the bow of the Titanic dipped deeper and deeper. The deck lights became yellow and dim. The tilt was so severe that walking was difficult. In the first-class lounge, the 8 members of the ship's orchestra, led by Wallace Hartley, played him after him. Their music was a final, beautiful gesture of calm in the face of terror. It is believed their last song was the hymn "Nearer, My God, to Thee." They played until the last possible moment, until the deck beneath their feet became too steep for them to stand, and the sea began to crash around their instruments. All 8 musicians perished. At 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat pulled away. Over 1,500 people remained on board the sloping decks. The final messages from the wireless room were brief, frantic, and then silent. Jack Phillips, exhausted and frozen, was relieved of his duty by Captain Smith. The captain's final order, given quietly, was "every man for himself." The ship now stood almost perpendicular to the water, her stern lifted high against the black sky. The pressure on the center of the ship was too much. With a sound that witnesses described as a terrifying combination of thunder, metal tearing, and the ripping of fabric, the Titanic broke into two massive pieces between the third and fourth funnels. The bow section plunged immediately. The stern section settled back to a near-level position for a few moments, a brief, deceptive pause. Then, the water pouring in pulled it high again, the gigantic propellers exposed to the night. It hung there, silhouetted against the stars, for a few agonizing minutes before disappearing into the black ocean at 2:20 a.m. When the Titanic disappeared, a horrible, unforgettable silence fell over the ocean. This silence was soon broken by the most terrifying sound any human can imagine. The collective screams of over 1,000 people suddenly plunged into the freezing North Atlantic water. The temperature was -2 degrees Celsius, 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below freezing. In that kind of cold, life expectancy was measured in minutes. The cries of pain and fear went on for a long time. Then slowly, tragically, they began to fade as the cold claimed victim after victim. It was an unbearable sound for the few hundred survivors in the lifeboats, who could do nothing but listen. The rescue ship Carpathia finally arrived at 4:10 a.m. She was a smaller, less luxurious ship, but she was a sight of pure, overwhelming hope. She slowly began picking up the survivors from the lifeboats. Of the 2,224 people on the Titanic, only 706 were saved. More than 1,517 men, women, and children were lost. When the Carpathia docked in New York, the empty lifeboats of the Titanic were tied to her side, a haunting, silent procession of wooden coffins telling the story of the disaster before anyone spoke a word. The sinking of the Titanic was not just a tragedy. It was a profound cultural shock. It shattered the belief that technology had made humanity invincible. It led to massive inquiries in both America and Britain, which resulted in immediate, vital changes to maritime law. Lifeboats for all. Every ship must carry enough lifeboats for every person on board. Wireless 24/7. All ships must maintain a 24-hour radio watch to receive distress signals and iceberg warnings. The International Ice Patrol, a permanent patrol, was established to track icebergs in the North Atlantic. For 73 years, the great ship remained lost, a magnificent mystery resting in the dark, cold silence of the deep. It wasn't until 1985 that the wreck was finally found by a team led by Dr. Robert Ballard. She lay in two massive pieces, 12,500 feet below the surface. The site of the Grand Staircase well, now just a gaping hole, and the massive, rusted hull was a chilling reminder of human pride and loss. The story of the Titanic is the story of a giant with a fatal flaw. It is a tall, dramatic tale of the richest men and the poorest immigrants facing the same destiny, separated only by the courage of their final moments. It remains, over a century later, the most famous ship in the world. Not because she sailed, but because she sank, carrying a whole era of confidence with her into the deep.